All right, welcome. Today, we're diving right into agroecology. Now, this isn't just about farming in the traditional sense. It's about seeing farms for what they really are, these incredibly complex living ecosystems. To truly understand them, we have to think like ecologists. So, we're going to start by breaking the whole system down into its most basic building blocks, and then we'll put them all back together to see that big, beautiful picture.
So take a look at these little seedlings. If you're just thinking about production, you see a future crop. But from an agroecological perspective, we have to ask a much deeper question. What's the relationship between this one single organism and the entire farm's web of life? Getting a handle on that connection, well, that's step one. So first things first, let's get our foundation set. Before we can analyze anything, we need to be on the same page with our definitions. So, what exactly do we mean when we say agroecosystem?
Okay, so an agroecosystem is basically any area of agricultural production that we decide to look at as a complete system. This could be as small as a single field or as big as an entire watershed. And the real power of thinking this way is that it forces us to see all the connections. We're not just looking at the corn anymore. No way. We're thinking about the sunlight and water coming in, the pests that might attack it, the beneficial insects that help protect it, and of course the food and waste going out. It's all about seeing the whole picture.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with that core definition we just covered. Then we'll get into the ecological hierarchy. Think of it as the building blocks of the system. From there, we'll peek inside the community to see how those blocks interact. Next, we'll explore the engine of the system, the processes that drive it. And we'll wrap up by talking about how these systems stay stable, even when they're constantly changing.
All right, now we get to a really core concept in all of ecology. Just like any complex system, an agroecosystem has a clear structure. And it's built from smaller, simpler parts, all organized into what we call an ecological hierarchy. Everything starts at the most fundamental level, the individual organism. This could be one corn plant, a single pesky weed, or one tiny insect. The field that studies how this single individual responds to things like sunlight, water, and temperature, well, that's known as autoecology.
Moving up one level, we get to the population. And that's simply a group of individuals of the very same species. So our single corn plant is now part of a whole field of corn. And at this level, the questions we ask start to change. We're now interested in the dynamics that control the size, the density, and the growth of the entire group.
Of course, a cornfield is never, ever just a population of corn, right? It's got populations of weeds, all sorts of different insects, soil, microbes, maybe some birds. When we look at all these different populations interacting in one place, we're now analyzing the community. This is where we get into the really interesting stuff, like competition for sunlight or those beneficial symbiotic relationships.
This diagram here really lays it all out perfectly. We start small with the individual organism. A bunch of those together form a population. Then all the interacting populations make up a community. And finally, when you combine that living community with its non-living or abiotic physical environment, the soil, the water, the climate, that's when you have the complete agroecosystem.
Okay, let's zoom back in on that community level, because it's the specific relationships and the jobs, the functional roles of the species within that community that really define the whole ecosystem's character and structure.
We can actually describe a community's structure using 4 key properties. First up, species diversity. Basically, how many different kinds of species are hanging out. Second, dominance. Is there one species that's just way more common than all the others? Third is vegetative structure, the physical size and shape of the plants. And finally, and this one's a biggie, trophic structure, which is just the network of feeding relationships. Who eats whom?
So, trophic structure is the more formal term for the community's food web. It's all about the feeding relationships among the organisms. And this is so important because it's the pathway that energy and essential nutrients use to flow through the entire community.
In its simplest form, this flow looks kind of like a chain. At the very bottom, you've got your producers, the plants, and they're grabbing energy from the sun. Then you have herbivores, which are the first-level consumers, and they eat the plants. And then you've got carnivores, the second-level consumers who eat the herbivores. Simple enough, right?
Now this table gives us the formal breakdown for these roles. Take a look at that first row. Plants are the producers, and they're at the first trophic level. Their physiological classification is autotrophic, which is a fancy way of saying they produce their own food. Now check out the rows below. Herbivores, predators, they're all classified as heterotrophic, meaning they have to eat other organisms to get their energy. This table just gives us the precise scientific language we need to talk about all these different roles.
So, we've talked about the structure, the parts, and how they're all arranged. Now let's talk about function. What are the actual dynamic processes that make an ecosystem tick?
When you boil it all down, ecosystem function is really governed by two fundamental processes. The first is the one-way flow of energy. The second is the continuous cycling of nutrients. Remember those two words, flow versus cycling. They are absolutely key to understanding how these systems work.
And the difference between energy and nutrients is critical. Energy is a one-way street. It comes into the system as sunlight, it gets passed between organisms, and eventually it's just lost as metabolic heat. It does not get recycled. Nutrients, on the other hand, are on a continuous loop. The physical stuff, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, is constantly being cycled from the environment into organisms and then back to the environment again.
This diagram is a great illustration of that one-way flow of energy. Over on the left, solar energy comes in and gets captured by the producers. Now, as we move to the right, to the herbivores, notice that only about 10% of that energy actually makes it to the next level. The other 90%? It's lost, mostly as metabolic heat. This 10% rule is exactly why food chains are rarely longer than 4 or 5 levels. There's just not enough energy left to support more.
Now, in total contrast to energy, nutrients get recycled over and over. The process they use to move between the living, or biotic parts, and the non-living, or abiotic parts of the ecosystem is called a biogeochemical cycle. We group these nutrients based on how much organisms need. So macronutrients, like carbon and nitrogen, are needed in huge quantities. Micronutrients are just as vital, but they're only needed in tiny amounts.
Okay, for our last section, let's tackle a really fascinating paradox. We've described this super complex system with all these moving parts. So, is it fragile or is it stable? Well, the answer, it turns out, is both.
And this brings us to a key property of ecosystems. At any single moment, they are in flux. Organisms are born, they die, populations go up and down, the seasons change. But despite all that constant motion, the overall structure and function of the system stay remarkably stable over time. We often say that natural ecosystems have two amazing properties: resistance to change and resilience after a disturbance.
The term for this beautiful balancing act is dynamic equilibrium. It's dynamic because it's always changing, but it's in equilibrium because it tends to stay within a stable range. And it's this exact property that allows ecosystems to persist for thousands of years.
And this right here brings us to the central challenge, and really the whole purpose of agroecology. If we accept that all ecosystems, including our farms, exist in this state of dynamic equilibrium, it fundamentally changes our entire approach to agriculture. The goal is no longer to just impose some static, simplified system on the landscape. Instead, the goal becomes to design agricultural systems that actually mimic the incredible resilience and stability of natural ecosystems. So the question we have to ask ourselves is this: how can we work with this principle of dynamic equilibrium rather than constantly fighting against it? Answering that, well, that's what the entire field of agroecology is all about.